Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, it's a rigorous examination of a single legal case. But it's really this extraordinary collision point.
It absolutely is. We're looking at what happens when the precise, sort of unyielding demands of philosophical logic meet the, let's say, the often vague language of law.
And we're diving into the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan, a scholar sentenced to 1 year and 8 months for picking quarrels and provoking trouble after forwarding some material on Twitter.
The facts alone are pretty compelling, but the unique element here, the reason we're doing this deep dive, is what happened next. It's how the case was deconstructed.
Right. It wasn't just lawyers. It was analyzed using the specialized tools of analytic philosophy. We're talking about thinkers like Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege.
Exactly. It's this ultimate intellectual confrontation. So we're going to explore what happens when a legal argument, one that's built on these very subjective claims, is forced to answer to a physicist who is trained in logic.
Okay, let's unpack this.
To really get the context, we have to start with Dr. Chen himself. He was born in 1976, holds a PhD in physics, and his specialty is nonlinear complex systems theory.
An independent scholar.
An independent scholar. And that is so critical because his professional lens, systems, chaos, complexity, that's exactly what he ends up using to fight the charges.
So what was the specific behavior that actually led to the charges?
Well, between 2019 and 2022, he used what's often called flipping the wall software to get on Twitter. And he forwarded and commented on various posts.
And the content was pretty diverse, right?
Very diverse. Artistic works like cartoons, political commentary, academic debates. And the charge that came out of this was picking quarrels and provoking trouble, but specifically the subcategory of knowingly spreading false information and causing severe public disorder.
Okay, so that specific wording is key. It gives the prosecution 3 things they absolutely have to prove. 1, knowing intent. 2, that the information was actually false. And 3, that it caused severe public disorder.
Exactly. And our sources for this deep dive are what we're calling the judicial trifecta, the 3 key legal documents. First, you have the indictment from the prosecutor.
And what did that say?
It just asserted that he knowingly spread false information and caused severe chaos. But the sources we have, they stress that this was only a conclusionary assertion.
A conclusionary assertion. So what does that mean? They just stated the outcome chaos happened without actually providing any facts or evidence to show how his actions caused it.
Precisely. There's no causal link shown. And this lack of rigor, it just flows right into the first instance judgment, which found him guilty. And this is where we see a truly striking logical leap.
What's that?
The judge explicitly used Dr. Chen's high education and knowledge level to presume his guilt. The argument was basically that he ought to be able to discern right from wrong.
Wow, so his intelligence, his intellectual capacity was actually used against him. That's the kind of thing that immediately sets off alarm bells for anyone who values critical thinking.
It certainly did for Dr. Chen. And then the final piece of this trifecta, the second instance ruling, just rejected the appeal. It maintained the original sentence.
And crucially,
the court decided to not open a hearing and noted that the appellant did not submit new evidence. Now, we're going to come back to that phrase later because it's a huge deal. It completely flips the burden of proof.
And that takes us right into Act 2. This is where Dr. Chen's physics background really becomes his main legal defense. He's not just denying the facts, he's arguing against the very logic of the crime itself using complexity theory.
That's right.
So let's start with that central element they had to prove, the severe disorder consequence.
So Dr. Chen, as this expert in nonlinear complex systems, he fought this on a purely scientific and causal basis. He argued that to get to severe public disorder, you need a snowball effect, a systemic collapse.
And he cited actual theories to back this up.
Yes, 2 of them. He used them to argue why his forwards couldn't possibly have triggered that kind of chaos.
Okay, walk us through those. How did something like the CAP theorem, or SOC avalanches theory, have anything to do with a few tweets?
Well, think of it like setting off a chain reaction. A line of dominoes. For a whole system, like public opinion, to flip from stable to chaotic, you need a huge concentration of energy at the start. You need to be at a critical state.
Okay.
Dr. Chen used the CAP theorem to argue that on social media, you have to choose between consistency and availability. Since he was a very low engagement user, we're talking fewer than 100 followers, almost no viral spread, the signal he was sending was just inherently weak.
So his signal, it just lacked the the potential energy, you could say, to start a system-wide change.
Exactly. And then he adds another layer with self-organized criticality, or SOC theory. This is the theory that describes how tiny events can sometimes lead to huge ones. The classic example is a pile of sand, where adding one more grain can suddenly cause a massive landslide, an avalanche. His defense argued, based on his analysis, that his posts were like adding single grains of sand so far away from that critical peak that they were, well, scientifically incapable of starting an avalanche, and therefore they could not cause severe disorder.
That is fascinating. He's literally applying the mechanics of physics to the court's argument and saying your entire premise violates the laws of system dynamics.
He is, and the factual proof, it was just waiting for him when he got out, wasn't it?
It was. After his release, he saw the very posts he was convicted for were still online. They hadn't been deleted. No one contested them.
And our source argues that's the strongest empirical proof you could ask for. The severe chaos they claimed happened.
Yeah.
It just never materialized in the real world.
So that consequence requirement failed, both scientifically and factually. Okay, let's move to the second element, false information. How did he use logic to dismantle this idea that what he shared were rumors?
He argued that for something to be false information, it first has to be a falsifiable fact. So he systematically broke down his content into 3 categories that just logically cannot be judged as true or false.
Oh, it was the first category.
Artistic creations. He pointed out one post was a cartoon, an Umbrella Girl cartoon, and he argued that art, by its nature, uses symbolism, metaphor.
Right.
He used this great example from a famous ancient poem where the poet Li Bai claims his hair is 3,000 zhang long. You don't read that and say, that's false, hair can't be that long.
Yeah.
You understand it's a metaphor for sorrow. It's symbolic, not a fact.
That's a really powerful analogy. Art is expressing an idea, not asserting a provable fact about the world.
Precisely. His second category was subjective emotional expressions, images of memorial gatherings or personal comments on economic struggles. These are feelings, sentiments, not verifiable facts.
And the third?
Rational opinions or academic debates. Things like articles analyzing political spectrums or public criticisms of governance. These are ideas for discussion, hypotheses to be explored. They are not and cannot be false rumors.
This breakdown just completely reframes the whole judicial argument. It forces the court to deal with concepts, not just content. Which brings us to the final and most philosophical element, the mingzi, or knowing intention.
Yes. The prosecution's claim was he knowingly spread false information, and their proof, again, was his high education. That education, they argued, guaranteed he knew better.
This is the core of that high education is guilt logic.
It is, and his rebuttal was brilliant. He said his intellectual habit, coming from physics and philosophy, is one of skepticism, not certainty.
So he viewed the post not as facts, but
as hypotheses. Hypotheses to be examined, to be shared for discussion, not facts he knew were true or false. He argued that to presume he had criminal intent just because he has a diploma, that violates the principle of no guilt by subjective presumption. A mind trained to doubt can't logically be assumed to know absolute truth.
This is a perfect bridge. We've gone from defending facts to defending the very nature of rational thought. And now we move from his defense to the pure philosophical diagnosis of the whole judicial process.
That's right. The critique uses analytic philosophy to just expose the mechanisms of the logical errors here. We have to start with Bertrand Russell, who demanded clarity above all else.
Russell's philosophy of logical atomism. The whole point is to break complex problems down into issues of logical analysis. The world is made of atomic facts, and those have to correspond to atomic propositions. Simple, verifiable, clear.
And when you apply that tool to the court's claims, like the vague charge that his posts caused severe disorder, you immediately see the problem. Those claims, they resist being broken down into verifiable atomic facts. They are undecomposed dogmas.
So terms like disorder are used as philosophical shortcuts that just hide the fact that there's no evidence.
Yes. Russell called this type of language loaded nonsense.
And why does that vagueness matter? What was Russell's fear about systems that rely on this kind of undecomposed dogma?
Russell saw it as a method for maintaining authority. When a court relies on a term like disorder that is defined only by its own authority, it's using propaganda language. The search for truth becomes a demand for conformity.
Which he saw
as superstition masked as rational order. The argument stops being logical and just becomes, it is so because I say it is so.
So Russell gives us the standard for clarity and warns us about authorities substituting dogma for facts. Now let's bring in Gottlob Frege, who made these rigorous distinctions in meaning that the court seems to have just collapsed.
Frege strictly distinguished between an expression's sense so, the way the information is presented, the thought behind it, and its reference, the actual object, the truth value, the thing in the world it points to.
The classic example being the morning star and the evening star. Different senses, different ways of thinking about them.
But the same reference, the planet Venus.
That makes perfect sense. So how did the court's decision confuse this?
Well, they committed the first Phrygian error, violent reference fixing. They looked at the sense of the content, say, an artwork symbolizing resistance, and then they forcefully declared that the reference of that symbol must be an attack on a specific leader or entity. They just ignored all other possible meanings.
They forced the meaning to fit their conclusion. They removed any room for interpretation or nuance.
Exactly. And the second related error is what Frege hated. He called it psychologism. Frege was adamantly against using subjective mental states, what a judge feels or believes, to determine objective truth.
And the court's decision to presume Chen's malicious intent based on his diploma
Is a prime example of psychologism. The conviction relied on the judge's subjective feeling about what a smart person must have been thinking, instead of requiring objective proof of his state of mind.
which is the core of the logical failure.
It is. And finally, the court made a category error. They applied a logical filter to the wrong kind of object. As Dr. Chen argued, things like opinion and art, they're concepts. They don't have a truth value. You can't prove them true or false.
So they treated these subjective things as if they were facts that could be a false rumor.
It's like trying to weigh a mathematical equation. It's a violation of the logical category of the object itself.
The sources really create a chilling narrative here. I mean, the judicial decision wasn't just factually flawed, it was fundamentally logically invalid. And these logical errors, they led to huge procedural flaws on appeal.
They did. They detail multiple issues. The original trial was held not openly, which is an immediate transparency problem. And the second instance, court upheld the sentence without even having an open hearing.
Suggesting they were just unwilling to engage with the critiques.
Unwilling to engage with the facts or the logic. And as you mentioned earlier, that final ruling completely reversed the burden of proof, which is probably the most damaging procedural violation of all.
It really is.
Yeah.
By saying that Dr. Chen did not submit new evidence to overturn the conviction, the court put the burden on the defendant to prove his innocence.
Instead of requiring the prosecution to prove guilt, this violates the cornerstone principle of innocent until proven guilty. It's a safeguard against exactly the kind of weak arguments we've been discussing.
It just paints this picture of rational thought battling against institutional inertia. The system, once it made its initial logical errors, just refused to review them. It chose closure over correction.
And that's why Dr. Chen's final communication included that incredible metaphor. He likened his position to Galileo facing the Inquisition, being forced to recant a scientific truth he knew was undeniable.
And what was the statement he suggested he might make?
Just as Galileo supposedly whispered, "and yet it moves," Dr. Chen suggested his final intellectual statement might be, "and yet rationality continues to operate."
That's powerful.
It's this declaration that reason, clarity, and truth, they don't just stop existing because an authority tells them to.
So what does all of this mean for you, the learner? This case is really a textbook example of how a legal system, when it ignores the fundamentals of logical clarity and evidence, can create a decision that is just scientifically and philosophically unsound.
The key takeaway here is the absolute necessity of applying those rigorous logical standards. Russell's demand for clear facts, Frege's distinction between sense and reference to all areas of law and policy. When that clarity is gone, law stops being a system of justice and just becomes a highly adaptable tool for subjective authority.
And that brings us to the final provocative thought, based on the source material. The sources argue that the conviction's real long-term social harm wasn't the scientists' low-engagement tweets. It was the chilling judicial logic that declared high education equals higher guilt. So if the capacity for critical thought and skeptical inquiry is officially designated as an aggravating factor for a crime, what is the ultimate fate of a society that begins to actively select for intellectual disability in its people? Something for you to mull over.